Before Martin Brundle was wandering around the grid asking celebrities if they know what a Formula 1 car is, he nearly lost both his feet, endured a rivalry with the legendary Ayrton Senna, and quietly became one of the greatest sports car drivers in history. This is the story of a racing driver who never quite got the career he deserved, but somehow ended up leaving an even bigger legacy. When people think about the greatest Formula 1 drivers never to win a championship, usually names like Stirling Moss and Gilles Villeneuve pop up. But if you ask drivers from the late 80s and early 90s who the most underrated man on the grid was, they might often say Martin Brundle. It was an era containing the likes of Senna, Prost, Mansell, Piquet, Hakkinen, Schumacher and many more. Martin Brundle was competing in what many consider the greatest era of racing talent the sport has ever seen, and yet he still earned the respect of the field. Nowadays, people know Martin Brundle for something entirely different, either as the calm voice in the commentary box explaining why someone's front tyres have disappeared after 12 laps, or the man getting pied off by Hollywood A-listers on the grid. For most fans now, Formula 1 without Martin Brundle and a microphone is unthinkable, but that's only half the story. Martin Brundle started his life in Norfolk in England. His father John ran a car dealership, and given this, Martin developed a curiosity for cars and a mechanical interest which would become one of his greatest strengths throughout his career. It was a skill that would later make him become one of Formula 1's very best development drivers, and eventually one of television's best technical analysts. Long before television audiences had heard of him, young Martin was tinkering with engines simply because he wanted to understand them. His family wasn't wealthy, so his first taste of competition wasn't glamorous. It was on grass and dirt tracks in basic self-built cars. It was light years away from today's expensive and organised junior formulas, but this did help him develop some invaluable skills because this type of racing has unique demands. The track surface changes every lap, the grip and racing line is always moving, and there's cars sliding and chaos almost continuously. It teaches instinct and car control, things that never really leave a racing driver. Another thing that grassroots racing teaches you is perspective. Because if every component costs money that your family probably doesn't have, you learn not to waste equipment. And when you've spent all evening rebuilding a gearbox, you're less likely to abuse it the next day. That mechanical sympathy became one of Brundle's trademarks. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't usually make headlines, but it perhaps gave you an inkling into why he impressed endurance teams later in his career. Truly fast drivers are rare, but fast drivers who also bring the car home are even harder to find. As Martin moved through hot rod racing and saloon cars, one thing became increasingly obvious. He wasn't just enthusiastic, he was exceptionally quick. And by the late 1970s, Brundle had become one of Britain's brightest young prospects. The next logical step was to start taking things up to a serious level by moving into single-seaters. By the early 80s, the pieces were finally coming together. There was a growing feeling that Britain had produced another genuinely world-class prospect. But Martin Brundle wasn't the only young driver attracting attention. From thousands of miles away, a young Brazilian had arrived in Europe. He drove with extraordinary precision, he was frighteningly fast, and he had a relentless determination. His name was Ayrton Senna. Neither man knew it yet, but over the next 12 months, they were about to produce one of the greatest championships motorsport has ever seen, and in the process, push each other closer to perfection than either thought was even possible. And that is where our story steps up a gear. But before we get to that, if you're enjoying this video, please do give it a quick like, it really does help. And now we head to 1983 for the British Formula 3 Championship. Back in those days, Formula 3 was effectively the final exam for a young driver. If you could win this championship, the Formula 1 paddock noticed. F1 team principals attended regularly and trusted scouts reported on every lap. The drivers knew that every mistake, every overtake could determine whether they became Formula 1 drivers. Martin Brundle entered the season driving for Eddie Jordan Racing. The late Eddie Jordan had built a reputation for spotting exceptional talent, and he believed that Martin belonged in Formula 1, and that opinion alone carried serious weight. Meanwhile, across the paddock, Ayrton Senna joined West Surrey Racing. Senna had already become something of a legend at this level. He dominated Formula Ford. People couldn't quite believe the lap times and his ability to find grip. The industry whispers were already touting him as something special. The championship was immense. Nobody else could keep up with Senna and Brundle. It was like a boxing match, with Senna and Brundle trading wins at almost every single event. One journalist later joked that the rest of the grid were basically spectators with better seats, and he wasn't far off. Eventually, Senna won the points championship overall with 132 points to Brundle's 123, but it was clear that Brundle could match Senna for pace. Senna had taken 12 wins while Brundle had taken 7, no one else had even come close. Years later, Brundle admitted that racing Senna made him better, you simply couldn't afford an off weekend. They pushed each other massively, and as a result they both became better drivers. The rivalry had become so intense that some journalists had started covering Formula 3 like Formula 1. The crowds and interest exploded. People realised that they were watching something special. These were two teenagers who'd become future motorsport icons, already performing at an astonishing level. One would go on to become a legendary 3-time world champion, and the other, well, his path would become a bit more complicated. In the background of this epic season, Formula 1 teams had been paying increasingly close attention. This wasn't just about a championship, it had become an audition, and at the end of the season, both men were promoted to Formula 1. Both were regarded as future stars, and both were joining underdog teams. They both had their entire careers ahead of them. At the beginning of 1984, Martin Brundle and Ayrton Senna looked equally promising. But neither man could possibly know that before the season was over, one single impact with a concrete wall would send their careers in completely different directions. The Formula 1 grid of 1984 wasn't just competitive, it was like a who's who of Formula 1 legends. Brundle signed for Tyrrell, a team with decent history but one that was struggling with engine power at the time. On paper, the car shouldn't have been competitive, which makes what happened next even more impressive. But before I get into that, please do consider subscribing if you want to see more videos like this one. So the opening round took place in Brazil. Brundle qualified in lowly 19th, but races aren't won in qualifying, well, except in Monaco. It was a race full of retirements, but Brundle just kept his head down and crossed the line in an impressive 5th. Against one of the strongest fields in history, this was a superb debut. Meanwhile, Ayrton Senna's season started awkwardly with retirements, mechanical failures and frustration. Brundle was actually starting to look like the stronger rookie. His technical feedback was also exceptional. His engineers later spoke about how detailed his debriefs were, despite only having a handful of Grand Prix under his belt. This was a rare trait for someone so inexperienced. And this peaked at the Detroit Grand Prix, where he scored a brilliant 2nd place. For a rookie, in what was supposed to be a struggling Tyrrell, this was a stunning performance. But sadly there was a twist. Because 1984 produced one of Formula 1's strangest controversies, and it centred entirely around that Tyrrell. Officials believed that Tyrrell were breaking the minimum weight regulations. The allegations centred around the team's water injection system and ballast. After races, the cars appeared heavier than expected, and during races, not so much. Eventually, the governing body decided enough was enough, and after the Detroit Grand Prix, Tyrrell were excluded. And then, after further investigation, the punishment became even more severe. Every single result from the team's 1984 season was deleted, as if they had never even happened, including every single one of Martin's results, completely wiped from the record books. Officially, Martin Brundle scored 0 points during his rookie season. The statistic is technically correct, but it's incredibly misleading. Anyone who'd actually watched those races knew exactly how impressive he'd been. But somehow, even worse luck was about to come. Because while officials argued over regulations, Formula 1 travelled to a brand new track in Dallas, in the United States. It was a track that drivers hated immediately. Nigel Mansell later described it as one of the toughest races he'd ever driven, and it was considered by many to be highly dangerous given the lack of runoff areas. And not only that, but the brutal hot weather was literally breaking the track surface to bits. Despite the deleted results, Martin arrived in Texas riding a wave of confidence. People inside Formula 1 were noticing how talented he was, his future looked bright. But then came Friday practice, and in a moment, everything changed. Friday practice started much as expected. Brundle was settling in nicely. He was building momentum, but then, in a split second, Martin hit the wall hard. The impact was massive, the front of the car disintegrated. Both of his feet and ankles were shattered. Medical teams reached him quickly, and despite the violence of the impact, Martin remained conscious. That alone was remarkable, but it soon became obvious that the injuries were severe. He was taken directly to hospital. Every racing driver depends on incredibly delicate movements with their feet. This was a disaster, and returning to racing would mean a long rehabilitation. It was quite possible that he would never return to professional racing. At 25 years old, his Formula 1 dream had barely lasted half a season. Meanwhile, Ayrton Senna's reputation was exploding. The Brazilian rookie was becoming a global superstar, while Martin was stuck in a hospital bed. It's hard to imagine how he must have felt. The two had entered Formula 1 as equals, and now their careers appeared to be travelling in completely different directions, simply down to cruel luck. We'll simply never know how good Martin could have been, but many believe that the accident permanently changed him. Years later, Martin himself spoke openly about the injuries. The pain had never completely disappeared, and his full flexibility never fully returned. So while he adapted and compensated, he was never quite the same. And it's worth remembering that Formula 1 cars in those days required an enormous physical effort to drive. Drivers routinely applied over 100 kilograms of force to the brake pedal. This is what Martin was coming back to when he eventually made his comeback the following season. By the end of 1984, one thing had become painfully clear. The fairy tale rookie season had disintegrated. His team's results had been deleted and he'd suffered a massive injury. It was devastating, but Martin was determined that he still had something to prove. Sadly though, in the mid-80s, the difference between the fastest and slowest cars on the grid would be enormous. At some circuits it could be more than 3 seconds per lap, which can be the difference between first and last place. Martin stayed loyal to Tyrrell and Tyrrell stayed loyal to him, but sadly the car itself just couldn't keep up. Martin became one of those drivers whose performances don't always show in the final results. He was putting in heroic performances to drag slow machinery to a midfield finish, if at least it didn't break down on the way. So by 1987, Martin took a gamble and joined a team called Zakspeed. They were a German team attempting something incredibly ambitious. They designed almost everything themselves, the chassis, the engine, everything. It was like David attempting to take on Goliath. But sadly, the Zakspeed was horrendously slow, and scoring points finishes became almost impossible. Even being fast enough to even qualify for the Grand Prix became an achievement. Yet, despite that, his reputation didn't disappear. Quite often when drivers spend years at the back of the grid, people forget about them, but Martin Brundle was different. People still notice how he got the best out of a bad car, and how he compared to his teammates. On top of that, his exceptional technical feedback was still helping to improve cars. And that reputation stretched beyond Formula 1. Across Europe, a company with enormous history and enormous ambition was rebuilding its motor racing program. That company was Jaguar. Jaguar had won Le Mans repeatedly during the 1950s, the D-Type had become an icon, and they'd had legendary drivers like Mike Hawthorne. But then, for decades, not so much happened. So, during the 1980s, Jaguar wanted a big comeback, and to do that, they partnered with Tom Walkinshaw Racing. Tom Walkinshaw had a big reputation and could spot a talented driver. He believed that Brundle possessed exactly the qualities endurance racing demanded. He was fast but also smooth, consistent and careful with the car. For the grueling 24 hours of Le Mans, he was a great choice because Le Mans is as much about making the car survive as it is about driving it quickly. Brundle embraced endurance racing immediately, and before too long he was winning. And it was a perfect match because Jaguar were becoming one of the strongest forces in world endurance racing. Brundle played a huge part in helping Jaguar challenge Porsche's long-standing dominance. And finally, the results started matching the talent everyone had been talking about for years. At the end of the 1988 season, he was crowned World Sports Car Champion. The man who had been brutally injured just a few years ago had officially become one of the best endurance racing drivers in the world. And he followed that up in 1990, where he won the prestigious Le Mans 24 Hours, the crown jewel of endurance racing. But regardless of this success, Martin Brundle still had unfinished business with Formula 1, and before long it came calling once again, this time with an opportunity that would place him alongside one of the most extraordinary young drivers the sport had ever seen. The opportunity came from the Benetton Formula 1 team. They had been struggling, but behind the scenes they were getting the right people into place to turn things around. And leading the team was a young German whose confidence bordered on frightening. His name was Michael Schumacher. After a brief spell at Brabham, in 1992 Brundle joined Benetton as Schumacher's teammate. But Martin wasn't overwhelmed. He was one of the very few teammates who had the ability to sometimes match Schumacher for outright pace. which is an achievement in itself given that Schumacher would become one of the greatest drivers to ever have lived. But for all his great driving, he just couldn't quite score that elusive first Formula 1 victory. After Benetton, he raced for other teams like McLaren and Jordan, but circumstances never quite aligned. He scored podiums, but a win just kept slipping away. And the bad luck kept striking, such as his single season with McLaren, coming when the team were having a rare spell of performance struggles. His final Formula 1 season came with Jordan in 1996, and he stepped away from Formula 1 with 9 podiums in 158 starts. But those stats will never tell the full story of a man who'd matched Ayrton Senna, fought back from devastating injuries, kept up with Michael Schumacher, and become an endurance racing legend. And somehow, after all that, Martin Brundle's most famous chapter hadn't even started yet. Not long after retiring, television came calling, which was pretty typical. Many drivers became pundits and then eventually disappeared into the background. But Martin would become one of a kind. His level of insight was revolutionary and his honesty was refreshing. He wasn't afraid to say what he thought. In a sport full of carefully managed PR, Brundle stood out, which is possibly showcased best by his many famous pre-race grid walks. But in 2016, Martin yet again experienced another enormous personal challenge. While working at the Monaco Grand Prix, he suffered a heart attack, and with his typical determination, he recovered and returned to broadcasting. So next time you see Martin on TV passionately explaining something or winding up celebrities, just remember, this is a man who's battled the best and defeated the worst. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one on screen about the bravest driver that Formula 1 forgot.